No one saw it coming, that the next big thing of the 21st century would be the nation state, an artifact from the distant past. Yet it has suddenly become a global phenomenon, a driving force of politics in the United States and around the world, the subject of intense intellectual debate, fodder for newspaper articles and op-eds. The Washington Post lists 40 2019 books illuminating American national identity. The news has even come to Harvard. There, a professor of history is actually writing about American history and nationhood. And a professor of economics says that, quote, "There is something special about the nation state. It creates reciprocal obligations that don't exist across national borders." There is, to be sure, a resistance. One salvo against the organizers of this conference says that we are injecting a malignant form of nationalism into the American body politic and need to be defeated mercilessly. And that was an essay, not Twitter spattle. But in general, the mood has moved through the stages of grieving, from denial to anger to acceptance. Acceptance that the nation state is a living thing with momentum, rather than a dying relic easily dispatched by global progressivism. To wit, the race card and the Nazi card have been played so promiscuously against the nationalist proponents that they have lost most of their punch and often seem like mere flailing. Some liberals acknowledge, some even insist, that fraternal affections and group loyalties are natural and potentially even worthy. Some are beginning to recognize that social customs and national traditions are a much firmer foundation for political order than the ideology of atomized, free-floating individual autonomy. Beyond the world of political activists and intellectuals, these propositions have gained wide appeal, grounded in everyday experience. Even in the midst of all the scare talk, Scott Rasmussen reports that a substantial majority of Americans, even suburban women, have a favorable view of nationalism and American nationalism. So we political conservatives who have been aroused in our own way by the nationalist awakening have a great opportunity to recast and enlarge and proselytize our animating ideas. Following the first round of debates of the past few years, I say it is time to move beyond dueling litanies of the nation-state's past glories on the one hand and horrors on the other. Let me draw an analogy from earlier awakenings, the great religious awakenings that swept Great Britain and Europe as well as America in the 17th and 18th centuries. In the American colonies and early republic, the new religious impulses were much more populist, participatory, and enthusiastic than what had come before. They posited a new relationship between God and his people and among his people. It might have been said, and indeed it was said, that the awakenings were dangerous and divisive and threatened to rekindle the old, intolerant religious hatreds and bloodshed that had brought so many to the New World in the first place. Fair enough. But, as it turned out, the secular consequences of the awakenings were unifying and enlarging and also nationalizing. For one thing, they brought a great many women and African American freemen into Christian practice and belief. The first awakening of the 17th century, with its emphasis on personal responsibility and self-rule, was an important antecedent to the American Revolution, Declaration, and Constitution. The second awakening of the 18th century, with its emphasis on moral obligation and justice, was a vital impetus to the abolition of slavery. I am not suggesting a direct linkage from our earlier religious awakenings to today's nationalist awakening. The 20-teens are certainly not the 1930s, but they are not the 1830s or the 1730s either. There are, however, two important parallels. First, religion and nation are not threats or panaceas, but something more fundamental. They are central areas of human endeavor, institutional embodiments of human understanding and aspiration, of human excellence and folly. To oppose them is to oppose forces of nature. To say that the nationalist hatreds of the past means we should reject a political order of independent nations is akin to saying that the Crusades and wars of religion are arguments for atheism. Of course, some people do say these things, including some very smart people, but they are making empty debaters' points. They ignore the intrinsic claims of nationalism and religion and the circumstances of lived existence that give rise to them. The claims and circumstances should be addressed on their own terms. The circumstances that gave rise to today's nationalist awakenings, at least in the West, have nothing whatever to do with suppressing minorities or invading foreign lands. Instead, the new nationalism is a revolt against the failures and weaknesses of modern nation states. It is not intolerant or triumphalist, but rather is defensive, grounded in well-justified apprehensions of political and institutional decline. In America, our claim is that our national government has abdicated basic responsibilities and broken trust with large numbers of our fellow citizens. It has failed to secure the nation's borders and provide regular procedures for immigration and assimilation. It has delegated lawmaking to foreign and international bodies and to not a few domestic bureaucracies that have scant regard and no accountability for the interests and values of many of our compatriots. It has acquiesced in or actively promoted the splintering of the nation into contending racial, religious, and other groups and has favored some at the expense of others. It has neglected core American principles and traditions, separation of powers, due process, presumption of innocence, local prerogative, freedom of association, allowing them to atrophy or be subjected to political conditions. Now, these claims are closely aligned with traditional conservative precepts, although our activist and political wings have not always stuck by them in recent decades. That is why the nationalist awakening is our awakening too, and presents distinct opportunities for those of the conservative persuasion. Which brings me to the second lesson of the religious awakenings. It is that adamant revivalist energies, unruly and disruptive in the moment, may be precursors of social enlargement and a new sense of collective purpose. I'm choosing my words carefully. I did not say national unity and cohesion. That has never been the American way outside of wars and similar crises, and it never will be. All we need is a serviceable consensus on the essentials of American identity and character, sufficiently broad and representative for the tasks of cultural and political reform. The national conservatism we are developing at this conference is going to have some hard edges. It is going to provoke some clever counterattacks and dismissals. The rancor is evidence of the seriousness of the problems we are wrestling with. As the Danish physicist-poet Piet Hein wrote, "Problems worthy of attack prove their worth by fighting back." But the American nation is not only vast, heterogeneous, and fractious, but also tough, resilient, and practical. The ideas we are developing have broad transcultural potential. Modern progressivism has turned against essential precepts of the American liberal tradition, such as equal opportunity and freedom of inquiry, religion, and enterprise. We are assimilating them into national conservatism, and old-fashioned liberals cannot help but notice. The times are dire, our prospects of success are uncertain at best, but we have a great deal to work with. For the next 2 days, we will be blueprinting many different aspects of the architecture of national conservatism. Following the strong opening talks last night, let me move things along by suggesting that an important virtue of the nation state is that it is a constraint. The contemporary peaceable nation takes what it is given, its borders and geography and resources, its citizens and tribes, affinities and antagonisms, history and traditions, and ways of getting along, and makes the most of them. The order of independent nation states addresses international problems by working with the positions and interests of individual nations as they are. Many idealistic persons would prefer to do without these constraints and seek alternative arrangements that can operate with greater latitude and single-mindedness on the issues that concern them. One of the most arresting features of modern life in the rich democracies is the pervasive rejection of the idea of natural constraint. One sees this throughout culture, high and low, social relations, and politics and government. Where a boundary exists, it is there to be transgressed. Where a hardship exists, it must be because of an injustice we can remediate if we only have the will. Today's recipe for success and happiness is not to manage within limits and accommodate constraints, but, to the contrary, always to keep one's options open. Even one's sex is an option today. I do not know where this impulse came from. Perhaps wealth and technology have relieved so many age-old constraints from our lives that we have come to fancy that there need be no constraints at all. But whatever the cause, it is a revolt against reality. Resources are in fact limited. Lasting achievement is possible only within a structure. I realize that my own favorite field of economics is out of favor these days with many in this hall, but it has at least one profound truth, that of opportunity cost. Everything we do necessarily involves not doing something else. The illusion of endless optionality has been especially damaging in government and politics. A dramatic recent instance came in the Democrats' presidential primary debates, where many candidates favored a de facto policy of open national borders, plus free health care for everyone who shows up. This would plainly amount to an abolition of the United States of America. Still, the proponents would say in all earnestness that they have ingenious plans to make that work. That is an extreme instance of the phenomenon that every social problem or inconvenience summons forth costly new spending or regulatory solutions with hardly a care to where the resources will come from or what other problems will be slighted. It is a thoroughly bipartisan phenomenon, which has left us with a massively indebted government where trillions of borrowed dollars are spent on our own immediate needs with the bills kited to future generations. America is a rich and powerful and less constrained nation than others, yet it is much more constrained than we have led ourselves to believe. Thinking of ourselves as a nation state means, as Peter Thiel said last night, is a means of unromantic self-knowledge. National conservatism, by directing our attention to our nation as it is, warts and wonders and all, is a means of reminding ourselves of our dependence upon one another in the here and now, and of the constraints that are the sources of productive freedom. Thank you.